It is my pleasure to introduce one of CMC's newest professors, Professor Nicholas Buccola, who's here in our government department. He is well known in California, although he spent many years recently at Linfield up in Oregon. His both BA and BS is from Santa Clara University. His MA and his PhD is from a little school down the street called the University of Southern California. Today, he's talking about the life and legacy of Frederick Douglass. He will also be at Alumni Weekend that I mentioned, end of May, early June. Professor Buccola, thank you so much for being here, and I turn the program over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Evan. Thank you, Rebecca. I'm really honored to be invited to join this group. This series is one of the ways I really got to know CMC when I was getting ready for my interview. Actually a year ago exactly, I was here on campus for my interview for this position that I now hold. And so this is a special day for me. And I'm really honored that, I call myself an old rookie. I've been in academia for a while, but I'm a rookie here at CMC. And I'm really honored that the folks have the faith and trust to bring me out for events like this to share some of my work. So I'm really, really happy to be here with you. The plan is I'm going to talk for a little while about Frederick Douglass. I've spent a lot of time with Frederick Douglass back in those days when I was at USC. My advisor, when I was looking around for a dissertation topic, said, choose wisely. You might spend a lot of time with this person. You might spend more time with this person than the person you marry. I'm still married, but I also, he was right. My advisor, Mark Kahn, was right. I spent a lot of time with Frederick Douglass. I guess we're going on, over 20 years together. And I spend a lot of time thinking about Douglass. I'm teaching Douglass. Right now I'm teaching African-American political thought, a course that I added to the books when I got here to CMC. And my students read Douglass, and I'm actually in the process of grading their papers about Douglass. So I've been thinking about Douglass a lot lately, and I'm excited to think about Douglass with you. I'm going to share my screen, and we are going to, let's see, here we go. Okay, good. So I'm gonna go back to the beginning of this. Rebecca and I were checking the technology before we started. So my theme today is Frederick Douglass, American Revolutionary. And I'm gonna give you a sense of what I mean by that and present some questions to you as we get started of the ways I want us to think about Frederick Douglass today. And I have this quotation that I just think is a nice sort of starting point for how I tend to think about Douglass. So I'm not a biographer. I'm a political philosopher by training. Political theory is my thing. And so I tend to think about big questions about politics, our political lives, how we ought to live together. And my study of Frederick Douglass is really focused on Douglass as a kind of political philosopher. So you can see this quotation from this little bit of experience, slave experience. I've elaborated quite a lengthy chapter of political philosophy applicable to the American people. This is Douglass. This just captures, in very short form, the ways I want us to think about Douglass today. And I want to sort of invite you in to thinking about Douglass by way of imagining we are in this space here. This is Corinthian Hall in Rochester, New York. And this was the scene of Douglass's most famous speech, July 5th, 1852, a speech that has been come down to us, usually titled as "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" And I think it's a speech well worth reading, watching. You can watch YouTube videos. Every year on the 4th of July now, there's this really cool program where they have descendants of Frederick Douglass read parts of this speech. And it's a speech that's extraordinarily powerful for all sorts of reasons, but it really sets up this idea of thinking about Douglass as a kind of American revolutionary. So I want you to imagine the scene. We're in this space, Corinthian Hall. You can still go to Corinthian Hall in Rochester. It's an amazing place. You had about over 500 people there, and the Women's Anti-Slavery Society of Rochester, New York had invited Douglass to give a 4th of July oration. And this oration he delivers on the 5th of July. It's a speech that he spent a lot of time, preparing to give it. The speech, was at least 2 hours long, and it's a really complicated speech. But there's certain things that Douglass does in that speech that I think will serve as a great foundation for us today. Douglass starts out, in this space where it's a space that's on a day when people are thinking about the American founding principles. They're thinking about patriotic things. And Douglass describes this kind of feeling of celebration that is associated with the 4th of July. And he begins the speech in the way many orators of the era would begin a 4th of July address, talking about the saving principles that are in the Declaration of Independence, talking about the virtues of the founding generation. And so for the first, 20 minutes or so, the audience may have expected they were in for a kind of typical 4th of July address. And then Douglass shifts. And I love the historian David Blight calls this speech a symphony in 3 movements. And so the first movement is kind of this, it seems like we're going to get a traditional 4th of July speech. And then Douglass begins this little transition. And I just wanted to read a paragraph to you that sets up the sort of title of my talk today and this theme that I want us to think about. So after talking about the virtues of the founding and the founders, Douglass says this: fully appreciating the hardships to be encountered, firmly believing in the right of their cause, honorably inviting the scrutiny of an onlooking world, reverently appealing to heaven to attest their sincerity, soundly comprehending the solemn responsibility they were about to assume, wisely measuring the terrible odds against them. Your fathers, the fathers of this republic, did most deliberately, under the inspiration of a glorious patriotism, and with a sublime faith in the great principles of justice and freedom, lay deep the cornerstone of the national superstructure which has risen and still rises in grandeur around you. So Douglass is talking about, and the sort of the fathers, your fathers. He uses that your fathers, and he'll come back to that word your again and again in what follows. But just after that statement where he's asking us to think about the virtues, the courage of the American revolutionaries past, he then brings us to the present. And actually in the speech, in the original text of the speech, in all caps, just below that, it says the present. And he says, my business today is not with the past, it is with the present. And then he has there's this startling moment in the speech, and those of you who have read it will remember this. He says, fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? And he goes on like that. And you can imagine folks getting a little bit uncomfortable as Douglass makes this transition in the speech. And then the longest part of the speech is that part, the part he calls the present. He says, my subject today, my fellow citizens, is American slavery. And he goes on to give this really Jeremiad in response to all the American hypocrisy in that moment. So with that as our foundation, I have these questions for us to ponder today. Our question for Douglass is, what sort of an American revolutionary was he? And I think Douglass's question for us is, what sort of American revolutionary are we? What sort of revolutionaries are we? And I'm going to ask you to think about Douglass in a particular way. As I mentioned before, my work on Douglass is, of course, biography is part of the story. But I really am inspired by something Douglass himself said late in his life. He said, sort of he's been around for, 6 decades or so, and he's reflecting on his life. And he says, I worry that I will only be remembered as the slave who became an abolitionist. Now, Douglass's life story is remarkable and well worth studying and celebrating. But I think what Douglass was getting at when he said that is he really wanted to be understood in a more capacious way. He really wanted us to think of him, as you can see him pictured here, as a kind of political philosopher. He was not somebody who sat down and wrote a tome of political philosophy, working out all these big questions about how we ought to live together. But over 6 decades in public life, after Douglass escapes from slavery and spends nearly 6 decades as an agitator, as a sort of reformer statesman, through his thousands of speeches, his, thousands of written documents, letters, essays, and so on, through his activism, he is addressing these big questions about how we ought to live together. And so I want to address 3 big ideas today in my time with you: liberty, equality, and responsibility. And I'm taking as my sort of jumping off point the Declaration of Independence itself. So Douglass is going to, as the advertisements for this talk indicated, think of himself as a kind of refounder, right? He thinks of himself as part of the founding generation of the refounding of the American Republic during especially the middle of the 19th century. And so I want us to think about how Douglass reimagined some of these central ideas we associate with the Declaration of Independence. Liberty, and I'm just including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness together as kind of a bundle. Equality, and responsibility, something that I'll talk about how I'm connecting the idea of responsibility to this line that comes after the most famous lines in the Declaration, this idea of the obligation that we have to secure our rights. Those are going to be our 3 major topics today. So we're going to start with slavery. Slavery is the foundation of Douglass's thought. Douglass spends the first 20 years of his life as an enslaved person. And what Douglass does, if you read Douglass wrote 3 autobiographies, and he brings us to the plantation and describes what the world looked like through his eyes. And it's his description of what's happening on the plantation is beyond sort of mere description. It's beyond mere narration, right? He engages in a sort of analysis of what he sees around him, what conclusions he's drawing about human nature, what conclusions he's drawing about the nature of liberty and equality, and so on. So he's doing political philosophy in this autobiographical work. And so Douglass, this is one of the things that drew me to Douglass as a subject for my research in the beginning, was that I thought Douglass is doing this thing with something like natural rights, a sort of belief that human beings have rights by nature of their humanity, that is profound and rooted in experience in a way that many great philosophers of rights, who I admire and teach here at CMC and will continue to teach, Douglass is doing it in a slightly different way. And it's a way that I think those of us, as citizens, as scholars, as teachers, we should know this story. And so I'm going to give you a little sense of that story, particularly by way of the story of Esther, who is an enslaved woman that Douglass describes in all 3 of his autobiographies. And I want to use the story of Esther as a way, excuse me, to think about how Douglass reimagines the meaning of liberty in this context, and how he invites us to understand, to make real, right? What does this idea of liberty that we see in the Declaration of Independence, what does it mean? How does Douglass come to understand it through his experiences as an enslaved person? So the story of Esther, the background goes something like this. Esther was an enslaved person on the plantation where Douglass was. He calls her his aunt, and he says that he had watched Esther, and he'd watched her over these months and years. And one of the things that he discovers, and he's just a kid when this happens, he discovers that Esther has fallen in love with another enslaved person named Edward. And Captain Anthony, who's referred to in the passage I'm going to share as Old Master, ordered her to stop seeing Edward. And Douglass says, I knew even then as a child that Captain Anthony's order was motivated by jealousy. So Douglass knows that Esther is a victim of sexual violence at the hands of Captain Anthony. So Anthony orders Esther to stop seeing Edward, and Douglass describes what happens next in this scene. This unnatural and heartless order was, of course, broken. A woman's love is not to be annihilated by the peremptory command of anyone. Douglass describes waking up to this scene. Esther's wrists were firmly tied, and the twisted rope was fastened to a strong staple in a heavy wooden joist above, near the fireplace. Here she stood on a bench, her arms tightly drawn over her breast. Her back and shoulders were bare to the waist. Behind her stood old master with cowskin in hand, preparing his barbarous work with all manner of harsh, coarse, and tantalizing epithets. The screams of his victim were most piercing. He was cruelly deliberate and protracted the torture as one who was delighted with the scene. Again and again, he drew the hateful whip through his hand, adjusting it with a view of dealing the most pain-giving blow. The whole scene with all its attendants was revolting and shocking to the last degree. And when the motives of this brutal castigation are considered, language has no power to convey a just sense of its awful criminality. After laying on some 30 or 40 stripes, old master untied his suffering victim and let her get down. She could scarcely stand when untied. So Douglass, this scene is, in so many ways, it's hard to comprehend and hard to even talk about in a lot of ways. But Douglass wants us to, he wants to lay before his readers this scene and scenes like it. And he tells us in just the next paragraph, he said this was something he witnessed on multiple times, same victim at the hands of Captain Anthony. And Douglass says that this scene of what's happening to Esther captures the awful criminality, as he puts it, of slavery and the denial of liberty, right? So Esther is this person who's being denied not only her freedom in general, but her freedom specifically to love Edward. And Douglass says the physical cruelties of slavery are sufficiently harassing and revolting, but the existential or psychological cruelties of slavery, Douglass says, are in some ways much, much worse. So he describes that Esther is, being denied the right to author her own life in this fundamental way, and that for Douglass, that is the most cruel aspect of slavery, and knowing that one's condition is not going to change. And so Douglass develops in the shadow of slavery this philosophy of self-ownership, and this is sort of how Douglass is reimagining liberty in this context. And so I have here an excerpt from an 1848 letter that Douglass wrote to his former master. You can see Thomas Auld pictured there on the right of the screen. And this is one of those things that Douglass wrote this letter in 1848 to mark the 10th anniversary of his escape from slavery. And he, I don't know if he actually sent it to Auld or it was published in all these abolitionist newspapers. I love to imagine Auld like going to get the mail that day and like opening up this letter and reading it. And it's this remarkable document, again, Douglass doing political philosophy by way of this letter, but engaging the man who formerly claimed him as property on these ultimate questions of how we ought to live together. And you can get a little sense of Douglass doing this here in the passage. I won't read it, but Douglass is really defending in the passage the idea of self-ownership, the idea that each human being has a right to him or herself, and that they have a right to determine how they will lead their own lives, right? He's making these claims against Auld, and he's drawing on human nature. You can see he's also drawing on God in making this claim. And Douglass is essentially making the argument. He says this in a really simple way. He says, I've never met a human being who would choose slavery for himself. And so Douglass talks about the capacities human beings have, make them fit for freedom. And so that the capacity for reason, the capacity for moral judgment, the capacity to reflect on abstract ideas, all these things, Douglass says, are essentially human, and they are the basis for Douglass of a claim to human dignity. And so Douglass is saying to Auld, I am a man, you are a man, you have no claim to my life. The claim that you have to my life is invalid. And Douglass says at the end of the letter, one of the lines I love that's not here, but he says, I intend to use you as my weapon. Douglass says to this man who used to claim him as property. So Douglass, just that story of Esther and this open letter to Auld hopefully gives you a sense of how Douglass is taking this idea, the sort of promise of the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and giving us a sense of how he used the experience of slavery as a way to reflect on the meaning of those ideas and what the sort of consequences are for his contemporaries in their political lives. Okay, so that's liberty. So that's just to give you a sense, and we can certainly come back to any of those things in the Q&A if you'd like. Our second big topic is equality. So liberty, equality, responsibility are three big political ideas that we're going to work through with Douglass today. So Douglass, one of the things that really drew me to Douglass as somebody I wanted to spend all this time studying was when I'd read Douglass. I'd read, you know, the autobiographies, a couple of the autobiographies as an undergraduate, and I was, of course, taken by the power of those texts. But as I started to take Douglass more seriously as a potential subject for something like a dissertation, what struck me, you know, immediately was the capaciousness of his thought. So Douglass is somebody who, I think, when he said that line about not wanting to only be remembered as a slave who became an abolitionist, I think another thing he was after is he really had this very broad, capacious reform agenda. He was somebody who was deeply committed to the idea of equality and had all these different applications of that idea in his political life. And so I want to invite you to think with me about what equality meant for Douglass and the ways in which he used that in various political causes during the course of his life. And I have three examples that I'd like to touch on very, very briefly. The first is Douglass's defense of what he calls genuine republicanism, and the alternative, the thing that's being rejected here, is what he called bastard republicanism. And he associates this idea with the man pictured on the upper left of your screen there, Stephen A. Douglas. This is the other Douglas. Sometimes I call him the lesser Douglas, the little giant, the Douglas who, among other things, is famous for the debating Lincoln in those 1858 Senate debates. And Frederick Douglass was very interested in Stephen Douglas's ideas, and that the idea that Stephen Douglas is the idea we tend to associate with him is the idea of popular sovereignty, an idea that as the country expanded westward, that the question of whether or not new territories and eventually states would have the institution of slavery would be determined by vote, by a majority vote, and of course that's including only those who are allowed to vote in those places. And Frederick Douglass responds to this and says, this is not a genuine republicanism. This is a bastard republicanism. And I think what Douglass meant by bastard republicanism is it's a republicanism that's severed from its roots. For Frederick Douglass, any genuine theory of republicanism or democracy is rooted in human equality. It's rooted in a claim that all of us that there's a kind of morally relevant way in which we are equal to one another, and that equality is a basis for representative government, for some voice in our political system. And so Frederick Douglass looks at Stephen Douglas and he says this is an illegitimate form of republicanism, and it ought to be rejected. And so that's, you know, he rejects Stephen Douglas's blatant racism in his formulation of republicanism. So Frederick Douglass is looking for a more inclusive understanding of what republicanism is, and it's going to be rooted in this idea of natural human equality. So again, going back to that principle in the Declaration of Independence, Douglass is saying that we need to reimagine that principle in a way that's more inclusive, and it's got to reject the politics of exclusion that are practiced by people like Stephen Douglas. The second bullet point here is this was on the masthead of Frederick Douglass's newspaper. He starts his first newspaper, the North Star. Right there on the masthead, it says, "Right is of no sex. Right is of no color. Right is of no sex." Douglass was deeply committed to the women's rights movement from the earliest reform days to the day he died. So Douglass died on February 20th, 1895. He spent that morning at a women's rights convention in Washington, D.C. He came home to rest for a little while, and then was actually going back to the women's rights convention for another round. And he passed away as he waited for his carriage. And so that was how Douglass's life ended. And way back in 1848, when there was that famous women's rights convention at Seneca Falls that produced the Declaration of Sentiments, another document sort of reimagining the Declaration of Independence in ways that were defending the rights of women. Frederick Douglass was there. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the great suffrage activists of that era, said Frederick Douglass understood the degradation of women more than any other man that I knew. And Douglass had all sorts of arguments to deal with. You can see on the right of your screen this photograph, headquarters for the National Association opposed to women's suffrage. I love that photograph. I don't know the whole history of this photograph, but all these guys standing here and then this lady watching them. I just wonder what the backstory is. But Douglass, and other women's rights activists of his era were responding to all sorts of different arguments against the inclusion of women in the political sphere. And so I wanted to give you a couple examples of the sorts of arguments Douglass confronted and how he confronted them, to just, again, give you a sense of how he's reimagining these basic core fundamental American principles. So one idea that Douglass confronted was, and Douglass and other suffrage activists confronted, is that women don't need to be included in the political sphere because they are virtually represented by their husbands and their fathers and their brothers in the political sphere. So this idea of virtual representation was one of the anti-women's suffrage arguments that Douglass confronted. And Douglass, responds to this by appealing back to that idea of self-ownership I described in the letter to Thomas Auld. So Douglass has this idea that each human being owns themselves, and that is the basis for a claim not only to liberty, but to political liberty in this case, to being able to participate in the political sphere. So Douglass says, if man could represent woman, it follows that woman could represent man. But no opponent of women's suffrage would admit that woman could represent him in the government. And in taking that position, he would be right, since neither can, in the nature of things, represent the other for the very obvious reasons that neither can be the other. The great fact underlying the claim for universal suffrage is that every man is himself and belongs to himself and represents his own individuality, not only in form and features, but in thought and feeling. And the same is true of woman. She is herself and can be nobody other than herself. Her selfhood is as perfect and as absolute as is the selfhood of man. She can no more part with her personality than she can part with her shadow. So Douglass uses that idea of self-ownership to reimagine the meaning of political equality, to make this claim for the right of women to be included in the political sphere. Douglass also confronted this, an idea that was an anti-suffrage idea that went something like this. The domestic sphere, anti-suffrage folks argued, is ideally marked by harmony, and the political sphere is necessarily marked by conflict. And so we need to keep women out of politics because we don't want to introduce the disharmony of politics into the harmony of the domestic sphere. And so Douglass has, I think, a really powerful response to this that gives us a sense of his commitment to pluralism, not only in this context, but in others. He says that we shouldn't be afraid of disharmony, that sometimes disharmony can be beautiful. Douglass was a music lover, and he thought a lot about music. And so he says that we can sometimes find a kind of beauty in disharmony. And he says, I immediately suspect the sincerity of any human being, man or woman, who agrees with me all the time. And he says that, if we find ourselves in disagreement in the political sphere, that's okay. If we find ourselves in disagreement and that spills over into the domestic sphere, that's okay too. He says, how insufferably flat and stale would our lives be if we were always trying to have harmony around us? And so Douglass invites us to think about the ways in which disagreement in the domestic sphere is not the end of the world, which sort of makes all of us feel better if we've ever had disagreement with our significant others. And it has this real political import for Douglass. And so that's one of the ways he responds to that sort of argument in the context of the argument over women's suffrage. And then finally, I just want to say something briefly about this last point: right is of no nationality. I have a Thomas Nast cartoon from Harper's Weekly, and that was addressing the anti-immigrant campaign against Chinese immigration in the 19th century. Douglass was somebody who was a fervent, believer in the right of migration. He was somebody who was deeply opposed to the anti-immigrant movements of his day. And so the example that I think is the most useful, and it's worth reading if you get a chance, you can go and Google this speech Douglass gave in 1869. Think about how long ago this was. 1869. He gives a speech called "Our Composite Nationality," in which he makes a case for thinking about American identity in a way that really embraces pluralism and embraces cultural difference. And so he addresses in that speech all these arguments that are being made against Chinese immigration, economic arguments. I thought the one I would highlight for you in this part of the talk on Douglass reimagining equality, what would be the sort of Douglass thinking about cultural pluralism. So he talks about the ways in which a lot of anti-immigrant politicians are sounding the alarm because they're calling Chinese immigrants heathens who are going to introduce their heathen rites and superstitions into our culture and poison our culture. This sort of language is being used. And Frederick Douglass has, I think, a thoroughly progressive response to that that is in many ways, and again, this is 1869, is in many ways more progressive than a lot of things that we would hear if we turned on cable news right now. So Douglass says this, he says, even the matter of religious liberty, which has cost the world more tears, more blood, and more agony than any other interest, will be helped by the Chinese presence in the United States. I know of no church, however tolerant, no priesthood, however enlightened, which could be safely trusted with the tremendous power which universal conformity would confer. We should welcome all men of every shade of religious opinion as among the best means of checking the arrogance and intolerance which are almost inevitable concomitants of general conformity. Religious liberty always flourishes best amid the clash and competition of rival religious creeds. So you can see Douglass's thoroughgoing commitment to pluralism there. And again, this idea, you know, it has in that speech, you get a real sense of how Douglass is reimagining equality in a way that really is acknowledging the sort of the deeply, you know, human characteristics, you know, and talking about another line in the speech that I love is he says, neither a smile nor a tear has a nationality. And he talks about the ways in which we can find ways to connect with other human beings, no matter how different their cultural practices are, by way of some universal human characteristics. Okay, last major point, and then I will wrap up, and we'll have some time for conversation. The last thing is responsibility. So we have liberty, equality, and responsibility, our three big concepts that we're working through with Frederick Douglass. And I want to just say something briefly by way of framing. I'm thinking about responsibility in particular ways. So in the Declaration of Independence, you have the famous lines that we've recited 1,000 times. And then right after that, you have this line, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, and onward and onward. And so Douglass wants to ask a question of his country, and I think this is one of the things that's central to his political project, is that the theory laid out there is that we human beings have natural rights, and that those natural rights are supposed to be secured by the government. But Douglass has this question or this problem before him in those abolitionist years. What do we do when the government is failing to do that? Number one. And also, what is our obligation as human beings to our fellow human beings if the government is failing to protect those rights, and indeed might be participating in the violation of those rights? This is kind of the central question that drew me to studying the abolitionist movement. Was, you know, a lot of American political thought, there's a lot of language of liberty, there's a lot of language of rights, of interests, limited government, all these things. And they're all very important parts of the American political tradition. But the question that was really on my mind as I began to engage the abolitionists was this other kind of moral vocabulary, this moral vocabulary of responsibility, of obligation. What moral vocabulary do we have to explain the obligations we have to other human beings beyond this basic duty we have to not violate their rights? Are we living up to our moral responsibilities if we are simply refraining from violating the rights of another person, or do we have an affirmative obligation to intervene when those rights are being violated by someone else? That's like a big question, obviously has implications for international relations and all sorts of moral questions that we might raise as follow-ups to that. But Douglass, his project, as both philosophically and more importantly politically, is to convince us that we ought to care about the rights of other people, and to convince us that there is no freedom from responsibility. This quote I have here at the top, he says, there is no freedom from responsibility for slavery, but in the abolition of slavery. So that's in 1857, he makes that statement. in the wake of the Dred Scott decision, which said, among other things, that African Americans had no rights that white people were bound to respect. Douglass is saying that we have an obligation to vindicate the rights of other people. And that's central to his project. And so he ends up coming up with this doctrine he calls true virtue, which is the basic idea of true virtue. Let me just give you one other line from the speech with which I started, the "What to the Slave is the 4th of July" speech. When he's talking about the founding generation, and this is the part of the speech, the first movement in the symphony, when he's describing all these great things about the founding generation. He says this, and I think it's very intriguing and kind of sets up this idea of true virtue. He says, the fathers of this republic, the fathers of this republic loved their country better than their own private interests. And though this is not the highest form of human excellence, all will concede that it is a rare virtue, and that when it is exhibited, it ought to command respect. Now, it's a very interesting sentence, right? But there's the part there that I want to highlight is not the highest form of human excellence. Now, there's, one of the things the students and I do together is try to figure out, okay, what were the other candidates for the highest form of human excellence in Douglass's thought. But I think one of the ideas that is higher for Douglass is this idea of true virtue, which he describes in this way. He says, every well-formed man has no rest to his soul, while any other human is suffering a recognized evil. So it's this really strong sense of obligation to other people. I mean, it's superhuman what he's asking us to do, and I think on some level he recognizes that. So it's this really strong sense of obligation we have to vindicate the rights of other people. And he even goes so far as to use John Brown, artistically depicted here, as a model of true virtue. Now, John Brown, as many of you will remember, is sort of the most radical of the radical abolitionists. Brown is somebody who was engaged in guerrilla warfare going back into the 1850s through to 1859 when Brown was killed, and I'll tell you about that in a second, pursuing the liberation of other people. And so Brown is somebody who Douglass knew. Brown actually tried to get Douglass to join him in the raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, which eventually led to Brown's arrest and execution. But Douglass, right from the beginning, so Brown gets captured in 1859, and right after Brown is captured, Douglass has to flee the United States because he's a wanted man as a possible conspirator in the plot. But Douglass immediately starts giving speeches defending Brown. And a lot of abolitionists even, were not willing to do that. There were very few. Henry David Thoreau was another. But Douglass was defending Brown, not necessarily as a practical matter. He ended up rejecting Brown's plan and didn't join him, in part because he thought it was a suicide mission and among other things. But also Douglass wanted to defend Brown as a kind of moral hero. So Douglass says, he calls Brown, he compares him to Socrates, Jesus, and he calls him our noblest American hero. Now, why would that be the case? Douglass would often compare Brown to Patrick Henry, and Patrick Henry is remembered for, one thing primarily, which is saying during that founding generation, give me liberty or give me death. And Frederick Douglass says, compare that to John Brown. His motto was give them liberty or give me death. Right? So Brown is somebody who's willing to put his life on the line for people whose liberty is being denied. Frederick Douglass compares himself unfavorably to Brown. He says, Douglass says, I could live for the slave. John Brown could die for the slave. And so there's something about Brown that whatever, there's all sorts of critiques one can offer of John Brown, and Douglass was willing to do that. But as a moral matter, Douglass found something deeply inspirational about this idea. So I just have at the bottom here a couple of questions we might ponder, which is, what are the implications of this doctrine of true virtue for each of us? And not only for each of us as individuals, but also for each of us as we interact with our fellow human beings. One of the things Douglass's project is sort of essential to his project is trying to convince free people that they ought to care about those who are not free. And so one of the things I try to do in my work on Douglass is work out, in real, in political time, how Douglass did that. He has this urgent political problem, and he's trying to go out into the world and convince people to take action, to move from the downy seat of inaction, as he called it, And how did he do that? So it's one of the things that I've been thinking about over all these years with Douglass. So where I want to leave us is at the sort of with this idea that Douglass gives us in this really wonderful, very short essay that he wrote in 1860. So this is prior to the outbreak of the Civil War. This is after the execution of John Brown. Douglass writes this very short essay. It's one of these things where you just look at it and go, wow, it's how much one can get across in only, a few words. But he starts it out. He's now at this point been an abolitionist for almost 2 decades. And he says, we've been at this for a long time and things have only gotten worse. He says the abolitionist movement has had the richest jewels laid into the lap of its cause. He says reason, morality, religion, art, poetry, all those things have been marshaled to try to convince the American people to abandon this institution, and things have only gotten worse. And so Douglass says something he rarely would say. He says, I have reached a point of weary hopelessness. The American people they sit as if they're spectators in a theater, and they refuse to be moved from the aforementioned downy seat of inaction. And so Douglass presents his reader with this question: is how do we explain this terrible paradox? What that we're missing? Why is it that our commitment to liberty is so selfish? Why is it that this idea of equality that we claim is at the foundation of our republic is so narrow? And why is it we refuse to take responsibility for securing the rights of all people? And so Douglass asks his audience that question. And I think that's the question that Douglass is asking all of us. He says it's very easy to be an American revolutionary past, but it's much harder to be an American revolutionary present. And I think what he wants all of us to do, this is the kind of model of critical citizenship that I think Douglass embodied and really presents to us as a kind of model, is to constantly be asking ourselves about the gaps between our professed ideals and the way we actually live. And when our answers require it of us, that we take action to close those gaps. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to the conversation. I'll stop share so I can see people. And
wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Buccola. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat. You can also virtually raise your hand, as I mentioned. Carrie George had an interesting comment to your last question, because we're unwilling to make sacrifices. And I think that's a very curious comment on the human condition, I think, as well. While I'm waiting for questions, perhaps, Professor Buccola, you just joined us. This group oftentimes hears from professors who've been with us for many years. So it's very exciting to have you. Maybe comment a little bit on what you've learned most about CMC and joining this community, and what you see in our students.
Yeah, absolutely. I just love it here. I'm not just saying that because of the audience. I mean, I'm really, I pinch myself every day. I mean, this is just such a remarkable place. And I do think there's something, so deeply and deliciously countercultural about this place, in that there is I think a genuine intellectual curiosity that one, just sort of is in the air. I mean, and the students are so earnest, and they want to, they are seekers, so many of them, they really are trying to figure things out. And if they start going down a path, they want to read more, and so at first I was just trying to figure out, like, are the students here actually reading, or they're just better at faking it? And I think they're actually, a lot of them are reading. And so I mean, it's been a wonderful experience for me. I had a couple students come to the Parents Weekend lecture I gave on William F. Buckley and James Baldwin. And I said to some of the parents afterwards, I said, this is something that my students don't really get to see me do, which is lecture. I don't really lecture. And the thing I'll say about, another thing I love about CMC, and the 5 C's generally, is the classroom atmosphere really is one that is, at least, in my experience, has been just very vibrant. And I don't, I've had one bad day, with the class, and I gave them a little talking to, where people weren't just ready to show up and start talking about things. And But generally speaking, I go into the classroom and I'm really, really excited about what I'm going to learn. I'm really excited about what the students are going to say because they bring this seriousness to the text. And even if it's something I've taught 1,000 times before, Plato's Republic, or something I've done a lot of research, on Douglass, the students will find things, they'll see things that I didn't see before. So yeah, that's a little bit of reasons why I've got a big smile on my face.
It's fantastic. Thank you. Allison Aldrich said at Family Weekend and then again in the chat here, she's a big fan of the Open Academy, which is about viewpoint diversity and constructive dialogue and teaching our students to talk to people and to appreciate diverse viewpoints. And that much of your talk actually feels like it's rooted in the Open Academy as well. What do you know about the Open Academy, Professor, and how do you think that integrates into these kind of lessons and conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as I was getting to know CMC, actually right when I was, I think the week of my interview here, Professor Shields, who's one of the faculty, the chair of my department, who's very actively involved in the Open Academy, published I think a piece in the New York Times basically about the sort of Open Academy concept and some of the things that some of the virtues of the approach. And I would say I've been an Open Academy guy, for my entire career in academia. At my previous institution, I had something called the Frederick Douglass Forum on Law, Rights, and Justice, and basically it was not a place. I had no building. It was more or less a file cabinet in my office. But it was an idea. And over the years that I was up in Oregon, we hosted, dozens of scholars and student debates and, debates between scholars about various issues. And this sort of our general mission was to think about questions of justice and the rule of law and individual rights. And so I'm all about it. And I think it's really important for students to engage with ideas across the ideological spectrum, and especially to engage with ideas that they have, they come in with some suspicion. I'll just give you one example of this fresh in my mind from the aforementioned African American political thought class that I'm teaching right now. We're now in part 2 of the class. So we read Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs in part 1. Part 2 of the class is Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, and Ida B. Wells. And, it's a class that actually the 5 C's are very well represented. I have, probably about a third CMC, a third Pomona, a third Pitzer, and Scripps, I would say, and no Harvey Mudd in that class, but I do have Harvey Mudd in my other 2 classes. But yeah, I mean, one of the things about the experience last week was the students came in with a kind of deep skepticism of Booker T. Washington, and because they kind of there's a story about Washington that's been told many times that tends to oversimplify his philosophy. And the students came in, and I had some help in this. I was able to get, speaking of the Open Academy, I was able to get some funding to zoom in a speaker who's working on this book, on Booker T. Washington, that really complicates the story and talks about how Washington is often misunderstood and so on and so forth. And it was really remarkable to watch even the students who were just like ready to throw the Booker T. Washington reading out the window last Tuesday. By the end of class on Thursday, they had really, they'd radically rethought their position on Washington. And I think that there's something about that experience that all of us, hopefully have gone through in our lives, where we go into something thinking one thing and we come out the other side thinking something different, and recognize that this new different thing we think might be gone next week. I think that's part of, that's essentially human. And I think that CMC, going back to this, the countercultural nature of CMC, is I think this is a place where, that idea is not only just sort of expressed in, brochures and, by professors and administrators, it's actually, practiced, it's acted upon. And so it's just like every day, there are so many things happening that are inviting students into conversations about ideas that matter. And so, yeah, I'm all about it. So the Open Academy is great. And yeah, any opportunity I get, they invite me to do something, I'm always there for it.
I'm glad you're able to use funding in your classroom too to bring in a speaker.
Yeah, absolutely.
What it should be about. And following up on that, Allison wanted to know if you can talk more about the importance of disharmony.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, yeah, connecting the last question with that one is worthwhile. I mean, I think Douglass was somebody, I mean, we often romanticize, I think, earlier eras of politics. As you know, I have this discussion with my dad all the time. He's going to turn 85 in April, and you know, sometimes we'll have spirited discussions that often lead to disharmony. But I think there's a kind of way in which Douglass, you know, the sort of politics Douglass was practicing, you know, are a good reminder of the ways in which there was so much disharmony in Douglass's political life with his allies. You know, I mean, so like, set aside Douglass taking on, you know, Stephen Douglass taking on pro-slavery advocates. Frederick Douglass, there was deep disharmony within the abolitionist movement. His, you know, initial mentor, William Lloyd Garrison, the most famous abolitionist in the country, when Douglass arrives on the scene, they have a deep falling out over, you know, really essential fundamental questions, over questions of whether or not, you know, the Constitution is worthy of redemption. You know, William Lloyd Garrison famously burned a copy of the Constitution, you know, at one of his speeches. And so Douglass ends up taking the position that he believes the Constitution can be redeemed if read in a particular way, that it can be made into a glorious liberty document if we read it in a different way. And that leads to these deep, deep debates with again, people who are on the same side. And the same thing happens with Douglass and the, you know, women's suffrage advocates I discussed earlier. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Douglass have a deep falling out for a period in their life. But that day, you know, in 1895, when, you know, he's there at that women's rights convention, they've reunited. They've sort of like patched up the wounds, and they are working together again. And so I think there's something about that that's really, I think it's really valuable, you know, for students to, you know, one of the things I love about doing the sort of work I do with reading old books about politics is that these books are so alive, right? That there's so many ways in which we can engage them in a serious way, and we might be able to have a conversation about how we live our political lives today that would be really hard to have if we were just addressing it head on. So just to get, you know, the Booker T. Washington example is a good one where, you know, essentially what this scholar who visited us last week on Zoom confronted the students with this question of, you know, what do we do? Well, how do we confront the ethics of a political figure who is doing certain things publicly that lead folks to conclude he has particular commitments, and then privately he's pursuing another agenda that might make him more popular in certain circles, right? So it presents this kind of, you know, ethical political question that is relevant to all of their lives. And I think in terms of thinking about disharmony in our politics, students need to be able to feel like they can confront a question like that, and also feel like they are in a space, hopefully, while they're here in college, and they'll take this, you know, out into the world, ideally, where they can entertain ideas, right? Where they can invite an idea in for a drink, for some Pinot Noir, and have you know, think about the idea for a while, and then, you know, maybe reject it, but at least entertain it as a serious possibility. I love one more point, and I'll stop. Is the one of my good friends and a colleague who teaches at Columbia has this really wonderful thing that he says to his students. He teaches the, you know, the core program there at Columbia, a lot of, you know, great old books, and he says, you know, he always presents the students, whoever, you know, who they have, whatever the book is that week, in what ways is this author right? Like forcing ourselves to say, like, this person can't be wrong about everything, right? Is there some way in which they're right? What do they have to teach me? And I think if we go into interacting with each other and interacting with texts with that kind of humility, then I think the world is going to be a better place.
Thank you. I have to depart, but I'm going to turn the Q&A over to my colleague, Rebecca Pullen, to ask the next question.
Thanks, Evan.
Thanks, Evan. We have two questions in the chat. They're quite similar, from Carrie George and John Garcia, and I'll just ask both of them, and I think that you can answer both of them. I'm going to, let's see, where did I lost Carrie's? Who today do you see as representing Douglass' view more effectively today? And the other question is there or could there be a contemporary political philosopher like Douglass?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. And I think that, I guess sort of the general way I think about this is one of the things in my last slide that I had up. I choose that particular image of Douglass because it's kind of faded, and I often tell audiences that I choose that photograph because we can't see Douglass as clearly as we'd like, right? We have to deal with the fact that Douglass died in 1895. We have to deal with the fact that as we're trying to think about how his ideas apply in the present or who might be embodying his ideas now, we have to recognize that we don't know how the 20th century would have altered his views, would have altered his point of view. But I think, I mean, I would say my general, so with that being a sort of big caveat, what I think is really most important about Douglass, or I think the ways in which he models something for us in a maybe a more general way than the specific conclusion I reached in the talk would be this. I think of Douglass as somebody who models a kind of way of being in the world that I think this applies to politics, but applies to other things as well, in which he really he was anchored by some deep commitments that from the beginning of his activism to the end were there. And he says, and he actually uses the Declaration of Independence in one of his descriptions of this late in life. He says, my mission has been to take these principles and to reimagine them in ways in which more people are included, and we're actually living closer to these principles than we were before. I mean, that's kind of how he defines his mission, part of what I was trying to get across today. But he also, I think one thing about Douglass, so that's the first part, is the anchor. But then I think as we sort of act in the world, politically, morally, in whatever realm, I think Douglass was somebody who models a kind of pragmatism as well. I mean, he recognizes time and again, there's so many examples of this in his political life, where he takes a really strong position about something, and then he revises that position, and he's not, so like the example I always give students is like in 1856, he writes this editorial called, the title is, "What is my duty as an anti-slavery voter?" And he has a very strong thesis, which is that, your duty as an anti-slavery voter is to vote for Gerrit Smith, the Radical Abolition Party candidate, because he's the only one who is deeply committed to abolitionist principles, and anything else is wrong. Then 4 months later, he writes another editorial called "Fremont and Dayton," and he says, "You know what I said 4 months ago? I was wrong. Here's why I've changed my position, and here's what I think. I'm not going to judge you if you choose otherwise, but here's what I'm going to do, and here's why." And that's, in Douglass, the example of his changing his mind about the Constitution. It took him 4 years to be converted from a sort of reading of the Constitution as a Constitution could not be redeemed to believing it could be redeemed and read as an anti-slavery document. So I use those as examples to say that Douglass was somebody who said, even when we're anchored in these principles, and there's some of them that are non-negotiable, we also need to be dynamic enough to adapt, our application of those principles in the real world. And so, again, I think that's a lesson that is great to share with students. And I think it also, again, applies to all of us in how we engage in our lives. And I think it applies, again, to many realms of life beyond politics. And so it's one of the ways in which I think Douglass is a kind of prophetic, figure, and it's somebody that can give us a lot of guidance in various realms of life. But yeah, great question.
We have time for one more question. We are over time, but we want to make sure to ask Thomas Kennedy of class of 1964. Can you comment on Frederick Douglass being one, if not the greatest orator of the 19th century?
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. Yeah, I wish that, one thing, when Rebecca hosted, me at the Parents Weekend last week, I was able to play a couple clips from the Buckley Baldwin debate. And when we were checking the technology in this one, I said, I don't have any recordings of Frederick Douglass, unfortunately. But man, I would love, love to have heard Douglass speak. Yeah, I mean, I think that, for folks who are interested in sort of, the Douglass, reading the autobiographies is great. And of course, David Blight wrote this massive, doorstop biography, great author, David Blight, and a great book. And I think Blight does a really nice job capturing, the power of what it was like to be in a space with this amazing orator. Yeah, I think that, Douglass is somebody who is so steeped in ideas. I mean, in some ways, he gave himself this amazing liberal arts education, and he was so, deeply engaged in the history of ideas. And he really had this profound faith in the power of language to change the world. And so there's a kind of way in which he, words were his weapon. Words were, what he was, using to try to change people's souls, really. And so I think that, I imagine that part of the power of seeing Douglass speak was that this was somebody who was carrying the word, and however you want to interpret that. And then you take that with this sort of this unbelievable, command of language and this faith in language, with what by all accounts was somebody who could deliver those words, right? So, I mean, think about Douglass. One of the things I love is if you go to the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site in Washington, D.C., they have the kind of reconstruction of what, I guess the house was like. And one of the things that's kind of remarkable is they have these dumbbells, that are on the floor of Douglass's bedroom. And I think that was, that's based in some historical fact that Douglass was very, he always presented himself in a particular way. And he was, over 6 feet tall, over 200 pounds. And he was an impressive figure. The lion, they called him the lion, right? He looked like a lion. And he would get up there. And I think just imagining those folks in Corinthian Hall in 1852, you have not only you have Douglass standing up before this audience, and just alone, right? And he recognized the power of performance. That was something that he was very cognizant of how he was being perceived by others. And then he's there with these words. He spent all this time preparing this 2.5-hour speech. And he's going to, talk about the Bible, the Declaration of Independence. He's going to go and give this rhetorical masterpiece. And so, yeah, I think there's something about there's really, really, there's a lot of lessons there. But I would say to folks, the other thing I'd recommend people do, we can't listen to Douglass, but we can, John Stauffer and some of his colleagues at Harvard put together this beautiful collection of photographs of Douglass. They say he was the most photographed American of the 19th century. He may have been, the most well-traveled American of the 19th century, maybe second only to Mark Twain. But there's something about just looking upon the image of Frederick Douglass that I think is a lesson in itself. And I often do this with my students, whoever we're, studying, John Locke or Frederick Douglass or whoever. We just sort of like stare at them for a little while and just sort of think about what we can learn from looking at their these artistic renderings of them or photographs, depending on the era. But yeah, I think that there's something about Douglass as an orator that I would definitely, I think is well worth pondering as well. But yeah, great question.